Let's get started. So, thank you so much for joining us for the 7th webinar in our series, and welcome back if you've joined us before. Today, we're talking about allocations, management and maintenance for community-led housing, and we've got some really great guest speakers to talk us through it today. As usual, a bit of housekeeping from me first before introductions. So attendees, you don't have audio or video on. That's the default for the duration of the webinar, but there will be an opportunity to come onto the screen later if you would like to, and I'll explain how to do that now. So you should see some buttons along the bottom of your screen. These enable you to participate in a couple of ways. You can ask a question using the Q&A box, or you can hit the raise a hand button, which alerts me as the host that you would like to join with your audio and video to ask a question in person. We'll be having our presentations from guest speakers first. So if you do raise a hand during this time, I won't come to you until the second half of the webinar, which is dedicated to questions. There is another chat box that should be on the right-hand side of your screen. And you can put general comments there, links, resources, etc., that other participants may find helpful. But do make sure if you specifically have a question that you want answering, that it goes into the Q&A box at the bottom. So that's a bit easier for me to manage. So this webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded onto our Vimeo channel tomorrow. You can ask your question anonymously in the Q&A box if you don't want to be identified. And finally, hopefully you'll see when you logged in, I've got a poll that I've launched, which helps us find out roughly where people are joining us from. So it's quite interesting for us to know. Great. Okay, that is my housekeeping done. On to introductions. My name is Hannah. I'm facilitating today, and I work with Colin McDonald, who's also here on the Wessex Community Housing Hub. The Hub provides support and guidance for people in the Wessex area on their community housing journey. And we are also joined today with two great guest speakers who'll be sharing their experience of this stage of community-led housing. So first we'll be hearing from Khalid Maher, chair of Amani Housing Co-op, and all-round Renaissance man we were discussing earlier. After that, I've got a short video to play from a previous webinar we did with Max Comfort from Spring Hill Co-housing in Stroud. And then finally, we'll be hearing from Liz Maunder, founding director and secretary of Norton Subhampton CLT. In Somerset. So we'll have those presentations half an hour, like I said, and then move on to questions. And Colin is also on hand as the Hub's community housing advisor to help answer questions too. And then once we've finished, I'll be sending out a follow-up email of any resources that we have discussed. Great. All right then, without further ado, I will hand over to Khalid.
Thanks, Hannah. I'm going to share my screen. Essentially, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a potted history, I think, of our organisation. Can my screen be seen? Yes, good. Okay. Imani Housing Co-op, we're based in Southwest London, and we were formed in 1985. So I've got a few slides. So let me. Oh gosh. That's not what, okay, it did move. Yes, we were formed in 1985 and very much out of the post-urban riots that were happening at the time. We've got, now we've got 54 units, but we very much came out of, like I said, a BME housing strategy that the Housing Corporation developed at the time, and these are some of our properties. Here's a little timeline. A lot of the activity actually happened in that early period, and like I said, you know, there was a lot going on at the time, and I think, you know, some very bright people, you know, suggested that Black and minority ethnic people needed to have more of a stake in society. Very similar to, I think, the Community Housing Fund. At the time, money was thrown at the problem, and I think, you know, very much community-led housing. I think it's the Community Housing Fund. A number of community-led housing groups are now being formed as a renaissance, as Hannah said before. happening at the moment. And I think, you know, it's a great opportunity for people to come together and look at alternative housing. When we were formed, we were actually called Almacar Cabral, but the Housing Corporation at the time said, no, that's a political dissident, and you know, you can't have that name. So we had to change our name. And effectively, it was a group of, you know, youngsters in their teenage years, early 20s, coming together. And all of a sudden, we had to now, I mean, I think, you know, the primary task was getting housing, and people were kind of like shoving us along down this path. The secondary housing co-op that effectively held our hand was Solon Wandsworth, and they supported us through incorporation, registering as a social landlord, and initially accessing short life properties, and then we entered a development agreement to make good use of the funds in terms of developing new housing. So this is in fact a property I lived in, which now I think is, you know, is worth, I don't know, $500,000 going plus in Northcote Road in Battersea. And this was our first property in Tooting Broadway, Balham, Tooting Broadway, 1995. And the last property, well, it's not the last property we had, but the last property that came out of the funding was in Battersea in 1996. So our challenges, very much, we had to negotiate all of the working relationships with external bodies. You know, the Housing Corporation being one. You know, once they gave us the money, they sought to hold us to account, and you know, they had an inspectorate team, which, you know, at times we thought they were a bit too vicious towards us. I mean, you know, I think, you know, from the senior level, where, you know, they had the right idea of empowering and facilitating groups, the inspectors, I don't think, had the same view. So, I mean, this is the scenario of a typical housing provider, irrespective of how large that is. But as a co-op, we had to kind of like take on effectively all of those roles. And you know, we had to recognize that we're a business entity, so we had to have a coherent policy framework. We had you know, the legal obligations to comply with, and once you become a registered social landlord, that means, you know, effectively you've got to meet all the standards that the regulator sets for you. Needless to say, you have to have, you know, all the governance in place, and you have to have the operational systems in place. So that whether you're managing staff, you're dealing with consultants, as we were a lot in those days, you know, you had to have systems to take on contractors, monitor their work ongoing. So yeah, so this is the governance of the social housing sector. I don't know all the audience, you know, what level you're involved in, but effectively, once you get into housing or a registered social, or you get public funds, effectively you're in the system, and you know, at various stages you'll have interaction with all of these groups. So you have to now develop a skill set in terms of engaging with external groups. We took on our own staff in 2000, and effectively that meant, okay, well, not only are we dealing with you know, external relationships, but now you're managing staff. So where in the very early years everybody came together and they were managing everything together on a voluntary basis. And I think, you know, when you look back at especially the housing sector, pre 80s and 90s, you know, it was very much the woolly jumper brigade. And, you know, I think, you know, social housing is now, I think, you know, some of them moved on to being like captains of industry. So, you know, you have to develop, you know, really good relationships, support relationships with various groups that are out there. Now we have something that's called BME London Landlords that we're a part of. There's BME National. We refer, you know, for like policies or good practice in co-ops. We go to our umbrella body, Confederation of Cooperative Housings, and also we're a member of the National Housing Federation. So really, you know, all of these organizations give you that support to, you know, stick on the right guidelines in terms of, you know, what you should be doing operationally. So these were our first offices. This is way back in 1987. In fact, this is a picture of what it looks like now. It was pretty disheveled back in the day. And I think, you know, we took it on as short life housing very early on. And these are some of the key milestones. So, initial registration, our partnership with Solon, Wandsworth, who are, interestingly enough, are no longer around. And, the development of our homes, having to ward off the inspections of the housing corporation. In fact, we got through them successfully, but it's rather a painful experience. And then I suppose the breaking away from our consultants and employing our own staff was a key growing up issues. If you can think of our relationship with Solon, very kind of like a parent-child relationship. You become that teenager who just wants to leave home, and it becomes a bit tense. And then subsequently, as the years have gone on, to just sustain yourself as an organization is a big issue in terms of dealing with the environment as is. So in the last 10 years, our last stop was a stock transfer from a large organization. And again, this is where we're very small. We can be perceived as a minnow with a very large corporate, one of the bigger organizations. I don't want to say their name because I know this has been recorded. And that whole kind of like engagement, because I mean, the original deal was that when we could take on private finance, we would do it at the cost price. But obviously when we went back to them like about 15 years later, they didn't want to deal on that basis. So yeah, again, here's some of our properties. Our properties are mainly for people from the Black African Caribbean community, and this is our offices being used. I think somebody died, and they didn't have a place to hold the function after the funeral, and this is where we've been able to facilitate that. This is our website today, and this is our management committee. So I suppose I'll save the questions if anybody wants to talk about allocations and management and stuff like that afterwards. Really, that's our journey through the process of effectively having to grow up in that community, people coming together, reconciling kind of like all the differences, the forming, norming and storming, and then realizing that, it's essentially your business and you have to manage your organization as a business. So you have to grow up, pretty quick. And it's I want to come with a phrase, but it's escaped my mind. But yeah, essentially, you have to do the business. If you're there and you're providing homes, it's serious stuff, and you have to reconcile all the challenges that come. But you may be surprised to know when people come together, they really, people step up to the mark, and whatever comes before them, they can deal with. And so what I would say is use the support services out there, the umbrella bodies that are out there, but also maintain your independence within that, because essentially you're making decisions for your organization and for your tenants going forward.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's such a great story. I think one of the really encouraging things from that, Kylie, is that I think we've had a resurgence lately of the perception of housing co-ops and other organizations being new and exciting, and they're not new at all. They've been going for a really long time, and this is kind of testament to the great work that you did in the early years and continue to do, that when they're set up right and their management is right, and also governance and that kind of thing, which we've got a webinar on next week, they can go the distance. And that's a really exciting thing to share. Fantastic. Okay, so yeah, before we come back to if anybody has any questions for you, I'm going to play now a video I've just taken from a webinar that we ran earlier in the year when we were first entering webinar season, which is from a chap called Max Comfort, who was part of setting up the Spring Hill co-housing project, which is in Stroud. I've taken a clip from him, which is about him discussing allocations within that. So just as a little precursor to that before I go into it, if you're not familiar with the different types of community-led housing, we've also done some webinars, which this has been extracted from, about community land trusts, housing co-ops, co-housing, self-build and that kind of thing. They're not mutually exclusive, but sometimes they can be helpful definitions to have a grasp of. So it's a little plug for our webinars earlier in the year, if you haven't seen them already. So yes, this is Max talking about allocations within their co-housing project, which I thought you might find interesting. So I'll just share my screen now. And
so the legal model, as I say, was that everybody who lived there had a share in the company which owned the freehold, just a regular, simple, limited company. And everybody had a 999-year lease on their individual unit. And that actually works very well as a sort of self-balancing mechanism. But when you want to leave, you have to advise the management committee, which is all the residents, anybody living there, of the fact you want to leave and the cost that the price you're going to put on your house or your flat. And then there's a 28-day period from that time when co-housing as a whole can elect people to make an offer. You don't have to accept that offer, but it's kind of recognized that people do. If no one makes an offer from the co-housing group, as it were, it goes on the open market. So basically there's no control over who comes in, because anybody can buy it if they're not already snapped up by someone in the co-housing group, which often did happen, by the way. So in Denmark, which is where I went in the late 90s to look at how they were doing it there, we had a long weekend in Aarhus, and we saw 8 co-housing projects in a weekend. And what we learned there was that they're quite open about who comes in to join them. Their attitude was, well, they come and have a meal with us. If they like us and we like them, then they join. And pretty much that's what happened at Spring Hill. Now, I know other places, for example, you may have heard of a place called Ouch, Older Women's Co-housing. That's based in High Barnet in London. And it's older women only. And they have a very rigorous sort of monitoring and reviewing process before anyone can join them. So, you decide how you want to play this. It's up to you and your group. But basically, it's not that difficult to get out. And I think people would not have joined us had there been a really difficult way of getting out.
Good one to end on. Get out. So yeah, I thought that was a really useful excerpt to share from Max talking, because it's great that he illustrates, not just their process, but also an equivalent co-housing project can have a very different process. I think one of the main messages to take away today is that there's not a strict way of doing allocations, management and maintenance, but that hopefully with our guest speakers today and asking questions in a little bit, you might be able to sort of be signposted to the types of allocations, management and maintenance that you think would be right for your community-led housing project to pursue. So if you're happy, Liz, are you ready for me to hand over to you? I will unmute you. Great. Yeah, over to you.
Oh, hi. My name is Liz, obviously, and I'm the Secretary of Norton-sub-Hampden Community Land Trust in Somerset. Norton's a small village, but our Community Land Trust represents actually 3 villages. It's named after the biggest of the 3. So all together, we cover, in the 3 villages, there are about 700 people in Norton, and we cover sort of about 1,500 people together. So we're not very big. We completed our homes, there are 10 of them, and we completed them in 2014. Compared with the other 2 speakers you've heard, we're fairly new. We didn't get formed until 2012, but in terms of community land trusts, we were one of the first ones to be successful in this country. So the houses were occupied in 2014. And it was a very, very joyous occasion when that happened. We had a garden party and, a picnic, and it was really, really nice. So anyway, we sort of looking back over it, and I don't know all of people who are listening to this afternoon what stage you're at with your housing schemes. Perhaps you're sort of approaching completion, or perhaps you're right at the very, very beginning. You're probably looking at, or you will have looked at, the local connection criteria, because of course with community land trusts, the whole idea is that you are providing homes which will be affordable for local people in perpetuity. Which means that they won't come up for right to buy. The residents can have right to buy, but they would have to move out to somewhere else. So the houses are going to be affordable for local people in perpetuity. And that, of course, is what makes it attractive when you're thinking of starting out on this journey. It makes it attractive to think, well, a community land trust is the way to go, because you know that those houses will always be there. So you, under the planning agreement, the Section 106 planning agreement that you will reach will be where your idea of what your local connection should be, and that will be the basis for the allocation of the homes. It can be, as long as it can be programmed into a computer, is what we were told. It can be as complicated or as simple as you like, as long as it's programmable. And ours is really quite complicated. I won't go into all the details of it, but it is quite a complicated formula. I was going to say algorithm, but algorithm's become a dirty word recently. But it works. It does work. And you're also, as well as thinking about that and your future allocation policy, you're going to want to know how, or you're going to consider how you're going to develop your schemes. Now, we in Norton decided at a very early stage, in fact, right at the beginning, that we wanted to partner with a housing association. We felt that while we were an incredibly committed group, absolutely dead set on acquiring these homes for local people, we didn't have any expertise. We had no planners, no builders, nothing like that on our group of dedicated people. We were just people, and most of us not in the first flush of youth either. So we decided that partnering with a housing association was the way to go for that reason, and also because we didn't want to take the risks of, the financial risks or the risks of dealing directly with the developers. But there are, as has already been said, lots of other ways of doing it. And as a community land trust, you don't have to partner with a housing association if you don't want to. You can become, like Khalid, a registered provider and sort of do the whole thing yourself. But I'm going to talk to you today about why we feel that what we did was right for us. It might not be right for everybody, but it was right for us, we felt. And starting with the original allocations of the homes, as I say, our Section 106 agreement was sort of quite complicated. We felt that we didn't want to know everything about our potential residents. We felt that as they were going to be sort of close neighbours and part of a quite close-knit and small community, we had no desire to know the ins and outs of their finances or their personal need. So we were quite glad that we didn't have to take that on board, and that our role would be to determine whether they fitted our local connection criteria. So we sort of, so when the houses were complete and all the first stage of deciding whether or not people were eligible for an affordable house at all, we then got a list of those who were deemed eligible, with their of course, in the process, they all had to say what their local connection was, and why they deserved to live in one of our homes, really, basically. So we got a list of those who were eligible. We were told whether they were in the gold, the silver, or the bronze band, which is a measure of need. The people in gold band need is far greater or more urgent than further down the precious metals. And we were, as I say, we were given the description of what they considered to be their local connection. The first thing that happened, which was a huge surprise to us and caused us quite a few laughs, was that a lot of the local connections we were hugely oversubscribed, I should say. So there were a lot of people there that nobody's ever heard of. And when we started investigating their so-called local connections, we found that quite a lot of them were completely bogus, which was a surprise. We hadn't expected that. But then that is one of it actually draws attention to the fact that the Housing Association and the other agencies concerned would not have known that those claims were bogus. So without our input on those original allocations, the houses could have, in actual fact, ended up going to a lot of people who weren't exactly honest and didn't belong to our community, which just goes to show the importance of having a community land trust and the local knowledge. So we having weeded out all of those, we were still oversubscribed, and we sort of came up with a system for sort of saying we had to obviously our houses, I'm going off the point a bit, but trying to explain, our houses are a mixture of 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom and 3-bedroom houses. 8 of them are for affordable rent and the other 2 are for shared ownership. So talking about the affordable rent ones first, we had to sort of be aware of which people were eligible for which houses. For instance, if you were a young couple and hadn't yet started a family, you obviously were not eligible for a 3-bedroom house. So we were aware of that. So we broke it down into who could possibly live in which house, and then we prioritized them with what we felt were the greatest, strongest connections, if you like. And we then said, well, this is our list. These are our second choice or whatever, that sort of thing. And this is how we feel the houses should be allocated. And it sort of, certainly with the 8 for rent, it worked absolutely, with one exception, where we had been unable to choose between 2 deserving families. And then sort of partway through the process, the Housing Association contacted us and said, of those 2 families that you've put in equal first place, can we suggest this particular one, because the mum is pregnant and she's just found out she's expecting a multiple birth. So can we suggest to you that she ought to take precedence, if that's okay with you? Which was fine, and we were consulted on it, and that was absolutely great. The 2 shared ownership ones we found were a little more difficult, and we had to be a lot less fussy. It turns out that it's, or certainly in 2014, and I would think it's really not much different now, that getting a mortgage for a shared ownership property is actually quite difficult for people to achieve. So we had to be much more open-minded about the sort of the local connection side of things, and be prepared to accept people who were from South Somerset, but not from any of the villages immediately around us. But that was fine, and that worked out really well as well. So that was the initial allocation. And then we then get to the stage of considering moving on and what happens after that. I mean, probably if you're listening to this and you're thinking that it's once the houses are built and occupied, that's it. It's not, is it? Because your houses are going to be affordable for local people in perpetuity. So, and then if somebody moves out, that means that somebody else is going to move in. And I have to say that the very first time that this happened for us, the Housing Association forgot to consult us, and we were not very happy bunnies. And so we remonstrated fairly strongly. Since then, every time there's been a change of tenancy, we have been consulted and our wishes have been taken on board every single time. So that's the first thing. You've got to think about the fact that this is going to go on. And we also thought very much about the fact that there was going to be maintenance of the properties themselves, and sort of dealing with any problems and everything. And presumably, if you're a community land trust that's standing alone and not partnering, you're going to bring in a management company, but then you're going to have to manage the management company. And for us, we felt right from the beginning, and we felt very strongly as time went on, that we were very, very glad we didn't have to do this, that any maintenance problems are dealt with by the housing association, and sort of things like that. We also, as a community land trust, have a couple of enterprises. We run our village shop and our post office, both of which are very, very time hungry. And we're glad that we haven't had to do that. And I know I'm slightly outrunning my time, but I think that's a sort of a thing that you need to think about is the sort of the ongoing management and whether you want to take that on or whether you'd rather not. We're aware that perhaps if you're a standalone community land trust, you feel more involved. And I don't know whether the financial rewards are greater. The way it works with us is that we have a 125-year lease with the housing association, and they pay us a ground rent annually. So we know what our income is going to be every year. It really is good. We have had one or two other problems, which I won't go into now because I've run out of time, with tenancies, but we haven't had to be involved, and that's been such a good thing. So that's just my experience. And we have felt enormous satisfaction. The people who live in our houses are hugely a part of our community. And it's been a really good experience. That's really how I want to finish.
Great to end, absolutely. That's great, Liz. Thank you so much. So I think that's raised hopefully some questions for folks listening. But I wanted to kick off questions by coming back to you, Khalid, and asking you a bit about the team of your kind of housing co-op management that you showed us at the end there. So obviously Liz and the Norton Sub Hamden, let's get them right. CLT, they were all new builds, I believe, Liz. So one of the interesting things I think about that is obviously as new builds, they've gone in, hopefully they're not going to start falling apart for a while yet. Khalid, how do you find sort of acquiring pre-existing properties and sort of the maintenance issues that they might throw up? Are they sort of different depending on each building, or and how do tenants sort of report, and who deals with that within your management?
Okay, it's an interesting question because now that we've been around for plus 30 years, maintenance becomes an issue on some of those properties that we refurbed. In the first instance, they were really well done to a very high standard, and when we took on our own staff, because we're consistent and we're a co-op, ideally you would say, we really care for our properties and we hold them to quite a high standard. But it's interesting when Liz talked about the whole allocations process, because if you can imagine now, a lot of people who were in the co-op originally, there's been a degree of turnover, and whilst we've taken on some nominations from the local authority, people coming into the cooperative didn't have the same kind of like cooperative, feel or cooperability or philosophy with them. So they very much started seeing us as a landlord or, a traditional kind of like council landlord. So the dynamic effectively changed. And, if you think about your original membership and, after a while that turns over and you've got kind of like new tenants in, you know, that is a real issue. So you almost kind of like revert into a default local authority management mode, because, you know, I suppose the society's evolved. I mean, you know, I think as things have got kind of like tougher, you know, people become more street savvy. You know, the dynamic between people and the state is sometimes a lot more tense. And, you know, we found that in the interaction amongst our tenants and staff, so much so that one of our staff members is a original tenant member. And, you know, they were all kind of like community development, you know, come and knock me all of the time, you know, come and, you know, give me a nod anytime you've got a problem, to the point where they don't want to see any tenants anymore, you know, kind of like outside of kind of like working hours. And it's a real, you know, it's a very real issue. So we've become kind of like a lot more professional in terms of holding the boundary, especially in terms of kind of like, you know, what's an emergency, you know, what's urgent, and so on. And once we try to deliver that top quality level of service, it, you know, over time, you know, it has an impact on staff. And then you as a management committee have to think about that impact on staff as well. And, you know, you're now kind of like almost going into, you know, corporate mode in relation to, you know, you're having to do that balancing between, you know, protecting the cooperative philosophy, reminding people that they're in a co-op, as well as recognizing, okay, well, we you know, the tenants have got rights and obligations by us, so we best make sure we're doing that service properly. But at the same time, having to placate the issues that our staff have, where tenants, you know, sometimes are really rude because, you know, they come from a you know, a totally different context. So it's interesting because, like what Liz said about, you know, you could hand over to the kind of like housing association, you don't have to worry about. When you actually take it on board yourself, there is a whole culture thing that you're looking to balance ongoing. And I think that's only going to evolve as years go by. You know, think when all of the original co-op members have died out and new people come in, you know, we're kind of seen as a mini council anyway. I hope that kind of answers the question.
No, definitely. And that does sound like a really, really interesting dynamic to manage, particularly as it's changed over time. So it's a good thing to flag up for people sort of entering into that. And I suppose, and makes me think back to when Liz is talking about, you know, really oversubscribed, you know, as well as people from, you know, not necessarily local to the area trying to get in on the action, is that there's such a huge need for community housing. We'd argue there's a really big precedent. But also that because people are unfamiliar with the structures under which they operate, yeah, they're going to deal with it and interact with it, possibly as they have done with other types of housing that isn't necessarily community-led, and therefore not necessarily know that there are cooperative principles, or, you know, that where community land trusts have come from and all that kind of thing. Great. Okay, that's some really useful stuff. I was just wondering, I definitely want to encourage, I know someone's raised a hand, but I want to ask them, they've had it raised since the beginning, so I'm just going to ask them if they do want to jump in and ask a question. But I wanted to ask you, Colin, if you've had any thoughts raised so far after listening to Khalid and Liz, and if you wanted to jump in with any other questions that have been brought to mind for you.
Well, I think that it was an interesting thought there about how allocations work, and I know that Khalid referred to nominations, and in fact, you know, I think the situation for Liz is very similar in that formally there are nominations. It's just that in Somerset, nominations tend to go through the Common Housing Register, so you don't always notice local, not necessarily seen as being the local housing authority imposing somebody on you. It's more, you know, whether you're a housing association or any other group, taking someone from that register. But I am intrigued by that, because I think, and I'm going to ask them both actually if I've got this right. But my perception of this is that in the case of the Community Land Trust, all those relationships about, you know, who qualifies, what are the criteria by which someone is able to bid for one of those properties in the first place. That's pretty much set out in the Section 106 agreement right at the beginning of the development, and what Liz was describing is sort of ongoing, how that's interpreted, and how that actually works in practice, whether there are systems in place, as you said, Liz, whether the computer can cope with it, but otherwise you can put those, whatever those criteria are, in place in the first place. I'm imagining in Khalid's case that you're actually dealing with a whole series of different criteria depending on where the properties are, and also I don't know whether you straddle more than one local housing authority, or in London context more than one borough, and in that case that might involve dealing with different criteria. I think the thing that's probably common to both then may be that you're both relying on people that you think should qualify for your schemes not being disqualified by the local housing authority to get on the register in the first place, if that's not an unfair question.
Shall I go first? As times evolve, what we do actually have our own waiting list, but where we cannot fill a property with our own waiting list, we nominate, or where we have a family unit, we sometimes nominate if there's not a kind of like a transfer internally. Now our actual rules state that it's got to be somebody in Wandsworth. All of our properties are in the London Borough of Wandsworth, and interestingly enough, we're because of our surpluses, we're looking at maybe purchasing another property or looking to develop, but that might not be in Wandsworth. So we're actually changing our rules to say, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be in that borough. So fortunately, we've been able to maintain our waiting list, but because we have so few properties, the turnover isn't that great. So you might have 1, 2, 3 years before somebody kind of like moves out, and then you may have in a year, because of people moving to another property or a tragedy happening, you may have 3 or 4 in the same year. So anybody on our waiting list, don't hold your breath. But at the same time, it makes sense to be on the waiting list. But one of our criteria is that you are registered with the local authority as well. So, and then I think what the local authority do, they recognize that mainly our mission was set out to provide for, Black African Caribbean. So they refer people within that criteria, albeit not people who really understand the co-op side of it. And famously, in the very, I heard Liz talk about when somebody moved out, they weren't consulted. Originally, I think when we were developing in the early years, you had something called Partners in Housing Need. So we were developing our properties, and we had quite a lot of people on our waiting list. And all of a sudden, Wandsworth Council came in and said, nope, we want all of those properties. And we had to do some really hard negotiating with them to say, no, we've been working hard to develop these, the people invested their time and so on. So, we compromised and said, okay, well, all of our single bed units, we're going to keep, well, it was in one particular scheme, that was all of the single bed units on that scheme we're going to keep for our membership, and all of the family units we will kind of like nominate. And, that, I think that put us in a almost like an unsavory relationship position with Wandsworth. And, I wonder whether or not that contributed to us not getting any more properties or being in their good books as a result. We've stayed this test of time. We've got surpluses, so we're going to hopefully develop some more properties. So I don't know if that answers your question, but allocations is a big thing. And then you do have conflict of interest, even inter-organization as well. And you have to be very careful about the processes that you have, because like you say, social housing is a cherished commodity. So you have to, have proper probity internally, because, people might want to kind of like, elbow in or leverage somebody into a position, so we've had to be careful in that context as well.
Yeah, I think for us, sort of what Colin was saying about sort of the either having people foisted on us, or the reverse, and people that we feel should qualify who we're then told don't. I can't think that that's happened. I mean, as I say, there was the very first relet, they forgot to consult us. And so that was that caused a little bit of an argument, but that was fine, and it hasn't ever happened since. We don't keep a waiting list as such, but we are very aware of people who wish they could come and live in one of our homes, because we're constantly being asked, because we are a rural community, we're sort of small villages, and everybody knows how the community-led houses work in our village, and you have to have that local connection, and people will sort of say, oh, my son and his family are coming back to Somerset and they really, really want a home. All sorts of things come up. And we are aware when people are hoping that they might get one of our homes, but we don't keep a waiting list as such. I mean, like Khalid, they don't come vacant very often. But I think we're also aware of the fact that, as I said earlier, somebody with one child can't be expecting to be allocated a 3-bedroom home, because that's not the way it works. When there's the sort of housing shortage that we have nationally and in this area, you can't under-occupy a house, and that's fair enough. So I don't think there's because we are ourselves very aware of what the criteria are from the other side, if you like. I can't say that we've ever not had somebody that we've wanted, sort of picked for a home. We might have 2 or 3 families for one home that's become vacant, that we feel are all deserving. But that's bound to happen. There's only one home available and the 2 or 3 families, and some 2 of those families are going to get disappointed, aren't they? Which is sad. I mean, I would just love to be in a position for us to be able to provide more homes, and perhaps one day it'll happen. But no, I wouldn't say that we've ever had any complaints really about the way that the system here works.
Great, fantastic. Okay, so someone's raised a hand, so I'm gonna see if they want to come and join us on screen. Hello, David. Can you hear me?
Oh, hi. Yes, I can. Yeah. So quick question for Liz. Well, actually, no, I've got a series of questions for Liz, actually. We're based in Kingston St Mary, which is a small village to the north of Taunton. And very similar, I imagine, sort of demographic. And so we're at a very early stage at the moment. We had a community plan and identified the need, general need for some affordable housing. I wonder whether we can speak offline, actually, because I think a lot of I was going to ask you questions about the terms and of the allocation policy. It'd be interesting to know a bit more about the background about how the need was established in the first place. And it seems the CLT route is the route that we would like to take, but would you be open to sort of having some questions offline?
Yes, I would be very open to that. And in fact, if Hannah could send you my email address, my non-Wessex one, preferably, Hannah, then we could correspond, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions. And in fact, if you wanted me to do so, I could come and talk to your group in person when we are allowed by COVID to do.
Yeah. Well, that would be brilliant. At the moment, we're actually, I've just joined the parish council, but persuaded them to the first stage is a housing needs survey to build on the community plan. So I think probably, but there is some resistance. There's still some resistance. We're sort of we're in an area of outstanding natural beauty, and there's some resistance to building new houses. And there's some resistance among councillors, I have shame to say, about the concept of affordable housing at all. So at some point a visit would be really, really useful, I think.
Yes, yeah. Yes, certainly. And actually, when you sort of say about people who don't want affordable housing, which I have to say through gritted teeth. The fact that the scheme will be community-led does help a lot to overcome that, you know, because you are able to, it's going to be for local people. It's not going to be them from up north coming down south or anything, any of these sort of stupid sayings. And it does help a lot that it is going to be community-led with that sort of situation. But yes, you know, definitely, you know, let's sort of talk, you know, offline, and you know, then we can look forward to the future when we are allowed to meet each other.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Great, thank you, David. And Colin's just pointed out actually that you might want to get in touch with Sue Southwell, I believe, at your local council. Be a good person to talk to as well. And just to remind folks that we do have lots of webinars that are available to watch that might sort of contain some extra information that might be useful to know on your journey. So yeah, we've got a few minutes left. So I had a lovely question in mind, but I've forgotten. So I'm going to see if I can grab that. But in the meantime, I'm just going to check out. We have had another question submitted. So Angie's asked, Liz, how did you think about the challenge of equity, conscious that it's often people with agency in the system who can decide for those who don't, thinking about what to do with people rather than for them, and how that relates to the selection process. Yeah, do you want to speak to that a bit if you can?
Yeah, I sort of, you know, the do with people rather than for people. I think that's quite important, isn't it? It's a matter of esteem, isn't it? I like to think that, particularly in our village, we are we're a very welcoming community. I don't think anybody ever considers, you know, that you're doing anything for people. You're doing, the way we look at it, I think, is we're doing something for the village. You know, we're sort of providing homes for the village. We're looking at the future of our village, you know, in things like the fact that if you have young families able to come here, then that's going to support the school. And in turn will, you know, keep the village vibrant, and that they'll, you know, people will support the village hall, they'll support the shop, and you know, and the pub, very importantly, you know. And I think it's a difficult one. We don't look at it that we're doing something for people. I mean, I suppose we are, but that's not the way we see it. We see it as doing something where the residents of our homes will become part of a community, and the village will benefit as a result. So I think that's how we see it, really. It's not what we're doing for the individual people. It's what those people will do to join in our community and benefit our community. I hope I'm explaining myself properly.
Yeah, and I think almost I was just wondering, Khalid, if that sort of rings true for you in a sense as well. It's the same thing. It's kind of, it's acting for your area, and obviously, yeah. So it's we were talking recently in another webinar about sort of communities of interest, and Max spoke briefly in the little excerpt that we showed of you know, you can do allocations based on communities of interest, so older women's co-housing or working with BME communities. So do you find that people understand that about the work that you do, that it's not just kind of, trying to think of the right words, almost like it's not just provision, but it's community building. It's, yeah, I don't know if anything Liz mentioned.
Yeah, no. I mean, almost kind of like by default. If you can imagine how the organization started, it was really people seeking to meet their need. And then, you know, as a result of that, we became or morphed into an organization. So as soon as you morph into an organization with assets, and if you think about, you know, it's the rent revenue model. So we're able to employ staff and so on, and we get inquiries over, you know, we're in the telephone book, you know, and we say housing, don't we? So, you know, we get inquiries, and through the network of people that live with, you know, live in our properties, and people know about us, your name gets about. So, you know, we provide housing advice as well, you know, and as such, we have to think about, okay, provision for Black, African Caribbean people in Wandsworth, because, you know, there are issues of poverty, unemployment, and so on. So you automatically fall into that space, and you know, as you know, with austerity, you might have other community groups that you know, no longer exist. You know, the funding is not there, the provision, and so on. You now, because you know you're in the Black, and you know we do training for our members and other community stakeholders as well, and we're seeking to punch above our weight, really, and because we're a going concern, it means, you know, if we become good at that, you know, then there's more provision to support others. So, you know, I play an active role with kind of like BME landlords, and I suppose this is the whole thing about, you know, once we became an organization, we started traversing the social housing landscape, and you know, whether that would be National Housing Federation, you know, it used to be Federation of Black Housing Organizations and stuff like that. So, you know, we were introduced to a kind of a whole new world, you know, outside of our, you know, our local network, as it were. So, you know, the organization and the skills that you developed as being part of a co-op led to, you know, other people kind of like developing their skills and being able to, you know, get employment and so on. And we're very hopeful to be able to, you know, support, you know, people, and also we've very much focused on the younger generation, because the whole thing, you know, as Liz was saying, you know, a lot of us are getting older, and the thing is going to kind of like outrun us, and so we're very keen to support the next generation come up. And interestingly enough, you know, a lot of us come from Battersea, and if you look at the cooperative movement in Battersea, which kind of like goes back, you know, I think you had kind of like Robert Burns, and you know, there's a whole you know, history of migrant communities coming into Battersea, and the host communities working, you know, working class, working together to so, you know, we very much try to kind of like espouse that and try to, you know, push the envelope forward and you know, give voice to people and support people in kind of like moving on. So it's very much about that cooperative spirit, and saying to people, yeah, you know, a lot of us got the opportunity to get this. So, you know, it's very much about kind of like passing it on down the line. And I think, you know, we all know what the housing cry. I mean, interestingly enough, coming from that cooperative movement, you know, I've been able to go into, let's say, the more corporate housing association sector and ask honest questions, because if you could imagine, you know, the culture is totally different, isn't it? You know, when, you know, you have a chief executive, he comes in and, you know, he's protecting himself, and, you know, they're all profiling and, you know, looking all professional. But essentially we try to make an intervention which says, let's not focus on that. Let's focus on moving the envelope forward and try and neutralize. And I think, you know, we've had a degree of success in terms of getting people to realize, well, that, you know, the real issue is the people that are suffering and need the homes. So let's focus on that rather than our own jockeying for position about, you know, how great we are as organizations and our profiles and such you like. So yeah, it is very much about empowering people and trying to come with common sense solutions, because there are, I mean, you know, if you look at, who is it, the New Economics Foundation, there's a lot of, you know, a lot of common sense solutions out there about, you know, how you could kind of like divvy up the land, you know, you could use government land, and, you know, there's not a lack of solutions on the table. And it's really about, you know, maybe bringing some of that information down to the grassroots level to empower people to realize that they, you know, they have to use we have to organization, we have to use our voice. And like Liz said, you know, it is about working with, if you involve people in on a process, you know, you may be surprised the commonality that there is with all people, because everybody just wants a decent life and everybody wants to live together in harmony and all of that stuff, you know. So.
All the nice stuff. Yeah, totally. Great. Wow, it's fantastic. Yeah, and it's all about sort of, it sounds like there's a real theme of like legacy. You know, housing isn't just for a year or two, it's for life. It's not just for Christmas. Great. Colin, I think you had some thoughts that you wanted to add, and we'll probably wrap up after that, if that's okay. But over to you.
Okay. Well, right. Well,
no pressure.
no pressure then. I was going to say I was quite struck. I mean, you said earlier, Hannah, about some of these things are not mutually exclusive, and some of our definitions overlap. And once again, we've heard from guest speakers from very, very different organisations, and yet there are some interesting commonalities, and possibly the thing that's striking in both camps is how individuals in a community come together in order to do something, in order to try to do something and hopefully succeed about housing need that otherwise isn't being met. And I think that's the key thing that kind of binds the whole of the community-led housing sector together, is that way in which what it's doing. I mean, we've heard about main housing providers. What most community-led groups are doing is complementary to that, and is looking at schemes and meeting the needs that some of the larger housing providers aren't able to do, but for whatever reason. We've heard in previous webinars about how some housing associations are feeling that a scheme has to be a certain size before they'll take it on, which may not be convenient for some of the community-led groups coming forward. And we've also heard in previous webinars about how different community-led groups have taken on sites that nobody else would want to take on. And again, taking on the more difficult things to do, but actually having the determination to do them. And in some ways, because the motivation is to get people housed, rather than make sure that the thing stacks up financially and produces a return, community-led housing groups can do things that particularly the private sector, but also some of the more commercially sensitive social sector may not want to do, may not want to tackle certain sites which might otherwise be eyesores. I'm kind of struck by that common feature amongst all the groups. Although today we were really supposed to be concentrating on different ways of approaching the live stage, and I guess the one thing I regret we haven't had enough time to talk about, we've asked Khalid about earlier perhaps, is that you did say that in your organisation you've taken on staff to do the work. And I suppose one of my questions, which will remain unanswered for the moment, is so when you've got a voluntary committee taking on staff to do all the work, are you then swapping the headache of managing that work as volunteers for the headache of managing staff and being a responsible employer? So which set of difficulties would you like to have? And I think, as Liz said earlier, it's a case of some solutions are right for some organisations and other solutions are right for other organisations. So you can see how in the case of the community land trust and the village scenario, working with a housing association, as I've said before, getting them to do all the heavy lifting most of the time seems to work. It won't be the right solution for everybody, but a lot of people that has worked well. And it does mean that you can sort of sit back and not worry about the repairs getting done on time, because hopefully the housing association is a responsible landlord that will get the repairs done on time. And then you can worry about other things. And in Norton's case, the other thing is keeping the shop going. And I think last week we heard from Hazel from Granby 4 Streets and heard about the work there where they'd taken on, I think she said it was 10 houses they got refurbished in the area that had been blighted, but actually that led to other houses in the same street being bought, which previously had been neglected. So you can see that sometimes community-led groups can do the work for themselves, but it's also leverage for the wider community. It also does other things. And my other closing thought is the one about the NIMBYs. And and I think wherever you are and whatever you're trying to do, you will encounter NIMBYs. And whatever you're trying to do, the question is going to be, which sort of NIMBYs do you want to argue with? And as Liz was saying earlier, the advantage of having a community-led scheme in your village or in your neighbourhood or wherever it is The advantage of it being a community-led scheme is you're more likely to persuade more of the NIMBYs, at least not to be quite so vehement in their opposition, and at least concede that there is a housing need out there that needs to be met. And at the very least, they might appreciate houses that are designed by local people for local people, rather than houses that have been brought on site by a volume developer that does the same thing everywhere, whatever site it is. I think those are my closing thoughts. I'm not sure if that's what you wanted me to say, Hannah, but those are my closing thoughts for today.
It was beautiful, Colin. Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, the fact that, you know, community-led housing really does catalyse change wider than itself in a community, which is so great to hear, and really great as ever to hear from some guest speakers who are, you know, reporting from the front lines of their projects, and sharing your experience with us. So thank you so much for that. So that just leaves me to say, I'll be sending a follow-up email with links and the recording and that kind of thing. We've got our final webinar next week about governance and democracy. So it definitely links into things we've been talking about today. Processes like Khalid mentioned, you know, how do you make sure you do that fairly and responsibly, and with accountability. So that would be really nice to explore next week. Great. Thank you so much, Colin, as ever, for joining us. And Liz and Khalid, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you this afternoon. I've really enjoyed it and learnt a lot. So that just leaves me to say thank you so much and cheerio. Have a wonderful afternoon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye. See ya.